Hello, everyone, and my name is Justin Steinberg. It's my pleasure to welcome you back to our annual Virgilio Lecture Series. I want to thank again the Virgilio Foundation for providing the generous funding for this series, which allows us to invite a prominent intellectual or artist from Italy each year to give a series of 3 lectures and collaborate with our undergraduate and graduate program. We are grateful for their support. I want to reintroduce our special guest this year, Sergio Luzzatto, the Emiliana Pasca Nether Chair of Modern Italian History at the University of Connecticut. Before joining UConn, he was a professor of early modern history in Turin for over 2 decades. His primary areas of expertise are 19th century and 20th century Italian history, 18th century and 19th century French history, and 20th century Jewish studies. Since this is the 3rd and final lecture, I will make the introduction short. However, I did want to mention one publication that I was not able to talk about on the first day because of technical difficulties. I want to call attention to this work because it is a collaborative project and it concerns literature. And I think in many ways, the talk today is in the same spirit. Sergio Luzzatto is the editor, together with friend of Chicago, Gabriele Bedula, of the masterful 3-volume collection Atlante della letteratura italiana, Atlas of Italian Literature, published with an Audi in 2010 to 2012. That atlas aims to replace traditional literary history with a geography of literature, mapping rather than recounting the 900 years of literature produced on the peninsula. This literary atlas demonstrates that not only is the saying true, no man is an island, but also no work of art is an island. In a world of disintegration and fragmentation, it nobly, and I would say even high-mindedly, insists on connectiveness. Reflecting on the lectures we've heard in these days by Professor Luzzatto's methodology, I think this idea of connectedness is a key for understanding his approach. What does history have to say to literature? A controversial question. I have lots of thoughts about this. But one thing I think that's interesting that's emerged in these lectures is that Professor Luzzatto does not necessarily approach literature as a traditional cultural historian would. That is, he does not use works of art to somehow reflect upon the zeitgeist or the era or even the environment. Instead, I would say that he, as I was saying, connects texts, that he places the literary text in conversation with other voices and other texts that are perhaps less monumental, perhaps less elegant, but nevertheless, I would say, existentially still important. And in doing so, he creates or he recreates or reconstitutes a type of network or web of voices that I think is a real contribution. Okay. The title of this 3rd and culminating lecture is The Dutch Kapo and the Flatness of Characters. And please join me then in welcoming back Sergio Luzzatto.
Thank you, Professor Steinberg, and thank you to everybody, particularly those who are brave enough to show up for a 3rd time, which makes a lot of effort, investment. I'm really grateful that you are here, and I wish I could, I wish we will have together extra time to discuss some of the kind of underlying themes of my undertaking here, which is in fact somehow an effort aimed at kind of bringing together or keeping together some historical standpoints and some literary productions, including, of course, and starting with, or mostly, um, dealing with the huge literary production of Primo Levi. Primo Levi wrote a lot, actually, and I'm showing here just the picture of his opera Omnia, both in Italian and recently in English. It makes up for, roughly speaking, many thousand pages, 5,000 pages in the Italian edition. The final list of names, the index of names, I have my micro here, should be good. Thank you for taking care of that. The list of names in the Italian edition contains 34 pages of entries, just of talking about the names. And the names have been one of the kind of angles from which I particularly in the first lecture, I tried to approach my theme. My theme, generally speaking, at large, is the one of Primo Levi and his companions. And I will, in the first lecture, I tried to overscore to what extent one of his problems was having been confronted to the very existence of companions who behaved in a kind of inappropriate way, according to him, to his judgment, to his judgmental eye, in the lager, in the extermination camp. And my second lecture, and that's why I focused particularly on not enough on the French character Henri, but at least on the Polish dwarf from Warsaw, Elias Linzin. And my second lecture was mostly taking the perspective kind of closer to the text of the use he had been having of the personal pronouns, and particularly the difficulty of the we, precisely because they were all in the same box, so to speak, which was the kind of segregated space of the concentration extermination camp, slash in the case of Auschwitz, because some of Auschwitz camps were extermination camps, particularly Birkenau, and others, including Monowitz, were technically not. Okay, and today I'm going to kind of bring you back to the actual life of some of his companions, and particularly two, once more. And each of the two characters I'm going to present you here have been assuming in the life of the camp and retrospectively in Primo Levi's memory a very kind of profound and deep significance, and not always for the better, because but somehow at least one of them, yes. The second one I'm going to introduce you to. The first certainly not, because the first character I'm going to present you following Primo Levi's text and Primo Levi's questioning is the very character of one Kapo, or Kapo, in the French kind of French accented jargon of the lager, of Monowitz, a Dutch Kapo. And I will show you to what extent Primo Levi didn't provide much evidence on this Dutch Kapo, but enough for the historian that I am to once more kind of trigger not only my curiosity, but somehow I would say, and not just my technical, so to speak, knowledge of the tools of the historian in order to match names with faces and faces with stories or histories, but somehow also my moral, not judgment, but my moral stance. Because in my opinion, even in the case of this Jewish Kapo, Primo Levi has not always been as understanding and as compassionate that we would have wanted him to be, so to speak, once we consider the circumstances under which all this took place. So there is Professor Steinberg was mentioning somehow the literary implications of my undertaking here. There is a kind of also literary theme or sub-theme in what I'm going to try to do today here, and that is what has been defined by a literary critic, the problem of the one versus the many. okay? Or the one against the many, and that is the relationship between the space of the protagonist and the space of minor characters in the novel. And of course here we are not confronted with the novel, but somehow we are confronted with this very same problem, because Primo Levi is, as he say, I, and as he is, of course, somehow the protagonist of the whole journey into the hell of Auschwitz. Dante has been one of the authors which have been coming back into this conversation. But there is something specific in the problem which dated back to the realist novel of the 19th century, right? The problem of the relationship between main characters and minor characters. I was curious to deal with the very issue of how Primo Levi tried to solve this problem in the very specific context of a place, a space, the one of the concentration camp, where the protagonist and the secondary figure share the kind of coercive space of a death camp. Okay, so how did he manage this kind of tension between? And that's also the reason why the title of this book is The Dutch Kapo and the Flatness of Characters. In my opinion, every now and then, so to speak, in some occurrences and instances, Primo Levi's solution somehow ended up being somehow a flattening of the character. And this is all the more problematic when the character in a stake is a victim, because somehow Primo Levi has been, in my opinion, and I hope I'm going to somehow, if not prove, underscore some evidence about that. In my opinion, Primo Levi took the very striking responsibility of flattening the character of a victim, and this is going to be mostly at stake with the Jewish Kapo. So let me introduce you to this Jewish Kapo with the very words of Primo Levi. Not yet with the other slide. You're all familiar with the name of Adolf Eichmann, okay? Here in 1960, he was captured before that, he was captured in Argentina by the Mossad. He was brought to Israel, and he was, of course, made the kind of showcase not only of the new Israel, but also of the embodiment of the responsibilities of the Nazi nomenclatura in the destruction of the European Jewry. And of course, Primo Levi was as struck as any Jewish of the diaspora or worldwide from the importance and the relevance and the symbolic power of the Eichmann trial. But Primo Levi did not limit himself to follow the trial as an Italian Jewish and as an Italian citizen. He somehow tried to contribute to the instruction, to the very instruction of the trial. And he reached out to the Prosecutor General of the Jerusalem trial, precisely singling out the Dutch Kapo. And this is what he wrote in 1960. Our department head, the Kapo of the barrack, or of the chemical commando actually, in the fall of 1944, was the Dutch Jew Joseph Lessing. What a name for a Jewish man, and what a name for a Jewish Kapo. By profession, an orchestral musician, he had 20 to 60 men under his orders, and in his capacity as head of Commando 98, which is the so-called chemical commando, he proved to be not only harsh, but evil. So we are back with this very idea of the evil Jew in the camps. And to the best of my knowledge, this is the only time that Levi ever placed on trial, literally speaking, because he was writing to the prosecutor, on trial, although the prosecutor was not actually there. He was there to prosecute Eichmann in Jerusalem, and not who knows where in the world of the diaspora, looking after Jacob Lessing, but symbolically enough, he was naming the name, so to speak. And in this case, he was naming the name with a judge or a magistrate, and he was naming the name once more not of a Nazi criminal, but of a Jewish victim. What was the knowledge that Primo Levi had on the possible survival of this Jewish Kapo? To the best of my understanding of his unpublished correspondence, he didn't know whether Joseph Lessing had survived or not. Okay? He writes to Jean-Samuel Piccolo, his friend and surviving friend from France, in 1961. He writes, Joseph Joop Lessing, Dutch, Kapo since August 44, musician at the Kapelle. This is what he knows, and he doesn't know whether this Jewish inmate who had taken the role of being the capo of the chemical commando had survived or not. Then you will, in those 34 pages of Primo Levi's opere complete, complete works, you are not going to find the name Lessing at all, okay? Because he didn't name the name nowhere in his writings. And so it has been my work as an historian to put dots together, to check dates, etc., and to come up with the conclusion that this Dutch capo, Joseph Lessing, actually, as I will show, had survived, which Primo Levi ignored. But I think he suspected that he had survived for some kind of reasons related to the feedback he had been gathering from other survivors. And so I just said he doesn't mention his by name, but he does have this kind of representation of this Dutch capo in one page of her story that is almost a article length story on Auschwitz that he collected. He published on La Stampa, the Italian newspaper, and he collected that kind of short story into a collection of articles on Auschwitz, which he later entitled Lilith e altre storie, Lilith and Other Stories. And so he has this page, and this is some information he provides about this capo. In November 1944, we had a Dutch capo who, as a civilian, had played trumpet in a cabaret orchestra in Amsterdam. As a musiker, he played the capo's band, and was therefore, there was an orchestra in Auschwitz, as much as in many, many other concentration camps. And to Primo Levi, this was, of course, one of the very aspects and very features of Nazi and German, not only Nazi horror, but of German corruption, moral corruption. Because the German people was, of course, the musical people par excellence. And the very idea of having brought this into the camps as a kind of mimicry of the inmates, because the band would play this kind of popular songs each morning in the Appellplatz for hours and hours, was to Primo Levi really something unacceptable. And I will share with you one page he has on that. But so he was a musiker, this Dutch capo, and he played the camp's band and was therefore an anomalous capo with dual roles. After the prisoners marched by on the way to work, leaving the Appellplatz, he had to come down from the platform, put away his trumpet, and run after the formation to take his place. He was a capo, but he was an inmate. And after having played, and as we shall see, after having taken advantage of the advantages of being a capo, because he was a musiker, etc., he had to run with the others into their kind of forced labor, everyday forced labor. He was a vulgar man, but not particularly violent. Well-fed, foolishly proud of the more or less clean striped pajamas to which his function entitled him, and very partial to his Dutch subjects, of whom there were 4 or 5 in our squad of about 70 prisoners. So which kind of privilege would the Kapo have? More food, cleaner clothes, warmth, being in the barracks, cigarettes, this kind of pretty menial advantages of being, but still good enough. And so this is something that escapes Primo Levi, how a Jewish inmate would ever accept to play in such a pantomime, to contribute to their, and he says that in If This Is Man, there were no Aryan musicians in the Jewish lagers. So these musicians, unfortunately enough, were Jewish, and those who played did so because they knew that there was something to gain in being musicians. And so Primo Levi almost never overcame, so to speak, the shock of this music played in freezing weather every morning for hours during the appel. And he has this very impressive page in Primo, If This Is Man. When the music plays, we know that our comrades outside in the fog are marching, because he writes this in the chapter Kabe from the infirmary, and so he writes this while telling the story from inside. We know that our comrades outside in the fog are marching like automatons. Their souls are dead, and the music drives them as the wind drives the dead leaves and takes the place of their will. There is no longer any will. Every beat becomes a step, a reflexive contraction of exhausted muscles. The Germans have succeeded at this. Their prisoners are 10,000, and the single gray machine. Mattia talking about the memory of colors and the importance of colors. The gray, which is going to become so important in Primo Levi's reflection in terms of the gray zone, is matched by this gray machine of people leaving the Appellplatz. They are precisely determined. They do not think and do not desire. They walk. During the marches of departure and return from work, the SS are always present. Who could deny them the right to watch this choreography of their creation? The dance of the dead man, squad after squad, leaving the fog to enter the fog? What more concrete proof, sorry, there's a typo there, of their victory? So when we talk music in Auschwitz, we talk a kind of subtopic of the lager experience, which meant a lot to Primo Levi retrospectively. And this is one of the reasons why I think that this Dutch capo never stayed present, so to speak, inescapably in Primo Levi's memory. And I will show you further kind of appearances of him in his works. And I think they became, the memory of this Dutch capo became all the more important and present to him after he discovered a book by Jacques Presser. And I don't have enough time to go over that book, but this is a very, very important book, which was published by a Jewish survivor in the Netherlands in the mid-60s. The Night of the Girondins, or the Girondists, apart from the reference to the metaphor from dating back to the French Revolution. Jacques Presser was a historian by trade, but he had survived. His wife had been murdered in the Holocaust, and this is a book which is about Westerbork. Westerbork was the kind of temporary camp where Dutch Jews were forced to stay and were gathered in order to organize the departure of the different convoys from the Netherlands to Auschwitz. Okay, and so Westerbork, it's the equivalent, the Italian equivalent of Fossoli, for instance, which was the Italian camp in Italy, except that because of the size of the extermination of the Jews in the Netherlands, through Westerbork, much more people went through than in Fossoli, including all the names you can think of, from Anne Frank and her family to so many other Dutch Jews, including the wife of this very author. So Primo Levi was very, very impressed when he first discovered this book. He didn't know Dutch, but he knew pretty well German. And so he read it in the German translation, which came out in the late 60s, early 70s. And he was shocked by this book, because this book introduced him to the very problem which is going to be at stake with my second character here. And that is the problem of the selection. The selection. How were selection organized in Auschwitz? On what matter, on what basis were the Germans, possibly not only the Germans, as we shall see, were they basically deciding who was considered to be fit enough to keep, staying there in the barracks and contributing through forced labor, etc., to the, more or less, to the war machine, the German war machine, or who was, recognized as a Muslim and being sent to the gas chambers. Why is this book connected and related to this issue? Because this book actually it's a novel, but it's somehow based on the very strong and deep knowledge that Jacques Presser had of the mechanism of the destruction of the Dutch Jewry. He went on writing the standard reference book, Jacques Presser, on the Holocaust in the Netherlands. And so, interestingly enough, actually, he had this kind of this dual kind of capacity, both of being an historian of the Holocaust in the Netherlands and one of the most successful and original novelist about that destruction. And so, to tell you the importance that Primo Levi ultimately recognized to the book, he went on to translate this book into Italian, without actually being that fluent or at all in Dutch. But he was formally and officially, Primo Levi, the translator of this book into Italian. The problem was that in Westerbork, people were kind of trafficking with the list of the people to sell to Auschwitz. And who were the trafficking people? Jews themselves. Basically, already in Westerbork, the Germans were doing what they were doing meanwhile in the concentration camps, and that is basically asking the victims themselves to be the administrators of the mass death of their own relatives and companions, etc. So basically, the collaborators in occupied Netherlands would ask for a given name of convoys and people to be deported every day to Auschwitz, and there were official kind of Jewish administrators taking care of the very selection of the people to put on those lists. Although basically everybody in Westerbork was supposed sooner or later to leave to Auschwitz, some of them were leaving, in a given day, and others were staying there with the more or less foolish hope of being kind of preserved from what would follow. And so the novel actually is about, the protagonist of this novel is a guy called Kohn, who actually is very much the kind of realistic representation of a Dutch Jew who was there. And Primo Levi was kind of obsessed by this character of Kohn, because Kohn was the Jewish victim helping the Nazis to perpetrate the Holocaust somehow. So this is the kind of match that, in my opinion, Primo Levi had in his mind, and that is he's telling the story of the Dutch Kapo, But at the same time, he's telling a story larger than that. And that is the story of Jewish collaboration. This is the as I was mentioning, this is the translation by Primo Levi, and this is what is at stake, right? And I already mentioned this category of the contagion of evil. From many signs, it seems that the time has come to explore the space that separates victims from perpetrators. This is the very first formulation of the concept of gray zone in Primo Levi. And it dates back to the mid-70s, and precisely to the moment when he discovers the book by Presser, and he starts being pretty much obsessed with this idea that the culmination of the destruction of European Jews, and that is the very process of a selection, was made possible not only by the German perpetrators, but by Jewish collaborators. Only a Manichaean rhetoric can claim that that space, the space which separates the victims from the perpetrators, is empty. It's not binary. It's not black and white, as I repeatedly said. It is not. It is studded with vile, miserable, or pathetic figures. Okay? As pathetic as Henri, as pathetic as Elias Linzin to Primo Levi. As I will try to show, as much as Primo Levi keeps and digs into this very problem of having survived, and having survived through compromises, his problem becomes, did I as well survive in that way? Was I responsible myself for compromising with evil? Is just a matter of grayscale in the way that we were all kind of blackened and involved in the destruction of our own companions. Okay? So there is a contagion of evil. It is typical of a criminal regime such as Nazis was to debilitate and confuse our powers of judgment. So Primo Levi the judge, Primo Levi who keeps, having his kind of judgmental eye stepping into his representation of the Holocaust, himself doubts about his own powers of judgment. Where do we draw the line? Should Kohn be judged? Okay, Kohn being the character of Presser, but also being the Dutch Kapo, being any kind of Jewish who assumed this role of contributing to the destruction, to the exterminating machine. So, as an historian, I cannot stop there. I cannot, content myself with what Primo Levi has to say about the Dutch Kapo. I have to go, take a step further and to go after this Dutch Kapo. Okay, so Jacob Lessing, I tracked down Jacob Lessing, and I was able to find his story. He came from a family of musicians. He was not just a trumpeter. He was actually a cellist, and he belonged to this pretty well-known orchestra, chamber ensemble in The Hague and in Amsterdam in the 30s. You can see here the Dutch Kapo to come as a very young cellist playing in The Hague in 1932, and this was Sarah Lessing, his older sister, and this was Karel van Gelderen, his brother-in-law, that is the husband of Sarah. Okay, So this is a telling story and a representative story, so to speak, at large, because we have here almost the proverbial, situation where Jews are musicians and they play orchestra, chamber ensembles, and they share, their roles. One of them is the pianist. The other one is the cellist, and Sarah was a violinist. Okay. And so they were recognized. I found them. I found reviews of their concerts in the Dutch press of the late 1930s, etc. And then the Germans arrived. Jacob Lessing married a Jewish woman with whom he had a young boy. He was born in 38 or 39. So right prior to the occupation, to World War II and to the occupation of the Netherlands, and so they were all arrested, and even the mother of Sarah and Joop Lessing was arrested. All of them were deported to Auschwitz, and basically the whole family, but the child, was exterminated. Okay. The parents, Joop and the mother, before being deported, as many Dutch parents did, they left the child behind, and they left the child with a Christian family in the Netherlands, of course, ignoring what his fate would be, and then they were deported. And why do I tell you this story? Why is it that interesting? In my opinion, it's a kind of, unfortunately, a very common story of destruction and death and murder and extermination, except that somehow I'm surprised that this kind of questioning that the historian is able now to ask themselves or himself was not the same kind of question which is covered, so to speak, by Primo Levi's writings. Even in the case of Elias Lynching, he didn't mention what possibly he ignored or possibly he was aware of. And that is that so many of his companions in Auschwitz had been going through this horror. Okay? And so, of course, Primo Levi, I'm not here to give lessons or to lecture Primo Levi. He has been such a wonderful moralist. And in my opinion, he was so intellectually so brave to question the very issue of Jewish responsibility and the responsibility of the victims. This is something which speaks to us even nowadays, okay? With regard to different contexts and in space and time. But I'm not here to cover current day of Middle East affairs. But this is something. So Primo Levi, to me, is really a paragon of intellectual bravery. But I think that he was a little bit quick in judging some of his companions. And just because I want to then move to my second character, I'm just briefly showing you the Dutch Kapo back to the Netherlands in the 50s. Still a violinist with the Brabant Orchestra in 1953. And so he made it. He made it through the Death March. He made it through Buchenwald, whereas his brother-in-law didn't make it. And I was very struck when I found on Facebook, actually, the photograph of the luggage of Karel van Gelderen in Auschwitz. Those of you who have been in Auschwitz know that there's a room in the Auschwitz Memorial Well where the luggages of the deportees is displayed. And actually, this is the very luggage with which Karel van Gelderen had arrived in Auschwitz. And so I found on their Facebook page of the son of the Dutch Kapo the photograph of this bag which had belonged to his uncle. There's a problem of moral responsibility even for the historian. Because who I am to judge? Who I am to judge is a famous sentence that Pope Francis said in an interview, and nowadays we are mourning Pope Francis, and so who I am to judge, who was Primo Levi to judge, and who I am to judge, I am literally concerned with the publication, for instance, of the lecture I'm delivering you today. What is this person who was the son of this Dutch Kapo, what is he going to think when he will discover that his father was a Kapo in Auschwitz? Through the book I might publish on all this. Is it my role to name the names? Is it my role to let a person of my age know that his father was a Kapo in Auschwitz? Many questions. But as I told you, the main issue at stake here is the problem of selection and of Jews contributing to the very selection of the inmates in the gas chambers, in this zero-sum game. And so the second character I would like to introduce you is one of the most striking characters which appears in Primo Levi's works. And as I will try to show you, it is directly related to the issue of who was writing or erasing the Jewish names of the kind of selected people from the lists of people to be gassed in, not in Westerbork in this case, but in Monowitz itself. And so once more, actually the starting point of my undertaking about this problem of selection is Primo Levi's writings. Comes from Primo Levi's writings because Primo Levi basically put so many kind of clues in his writings, and not all of them were kind of taken up by scholars. And so I'm now switching from this kind of Westerbork context in the Netherlands to Monowitz and Auschwitz-Monowitz itself. And I'm inviting you to consider the chapter in Primo Levi's If This Is Man, which he entitled October 1944. And this is the chapter of the selection, so to speak, where he represents the moment when he was pretty sick, or in any case, he was not in good shape, and so he was fearing the very possibility of being selected himself, except that he escaped and other people were selected at his place. And so he survived that selection, which actually was the last one which ever took place in Monowitz, because after that, the Germans, the whole machine, war machine of the Germans was falling apart, and there were no selection anymore until the liberation of the camp a couple of months later. So this is a kind of eponymous chapter in Primo Levi's first book, on the selection which took place in October 1994, and he describes in a very, very powerful page, and I'm quoting here, the crowd of frightened naked men, the charnel house of terrified bodies facing an SS officer and prisoner clerk. This is life or death of each of us. And he counted it there in the book. There were 96 of us when we arrived, the Italians of convoy 174000, only 29 survived until October, and of these, 8 went in the selection. Yet, despite the problem, the German kind of proverbial reputation for meticulousness, the selections were riddled with what Primo Levi defines irregularities. Okay? And so he tells the story of how fit men might be condemned to be gassed when some weak inmates might pass the selection. And he says that even the very selection at stake, this was the case because his neighbor inmate was in a better shape than Primo Levi, but he was selected to death, whereas Primo Levi survived. René, for example, so young and robust, ended up on the left. Perhaps it's because he has glasses. Perhaps because he walks with a slight stoop, like someone who is nearsighted, but more likely it was a simple error. So in the first edition of the book, If There's a Man, Levi treated this kind of irregularities as tragic but comprehensible, and rooted in the logic and the logistics of the genocide. Quote, "There is nothing surprising about these mistakes. The examination is very rapid and perfunctory." Except that in the second edition of If This Is a Man in 1958, Levi adds few lines to the ones I just read on René. And he writes, "René went past the commission immediately ahead of me, and there could have been a mistake with our cards. I don't know what I will think tomorrow and later. Today, I feel no distinct emotion of this possible error." And then later on, he will tell a journalist, "This René was Italian. I saw the widow, I did not dare to tell her." So once more, literary critics might, stop here and then, focus on possibly the most important matter, and the way Primo Levi addresses the issue of error, of fortune in the lager, of, mistakes which brings salvation or damnation, etc. And these, of course, are very important matters. I am a kind of petty historian who asks himself for themselves other kind of questions. And so my question was, who was René? And actually nobody was able so far to answer the question, who was René? Who was this person who Primo Levi thought went to the gas chambers replacing him, so to speak, into the gas chamber? And this is the list that Primo Levi himself wrote about the people from his transport that were deported with him. And these are very different names. And the way I identified René, because Primo Levi said he was Italian, I was looking for people of the same age because he provides the description. And then there is this pretty telling detail, Ortona Renato. Renato being the Italian version of René. So for comprehensible reasons, Primo Levi decided not to have the Italian original name of this person, but he pretty, easily converted into a French name just to hide this identity. And so I was able to track this guy down, and so this is Renato Ortona in the 30s. He was trained in economics, and he had served in the military before being sidelined by the racial laws. You can see basically to what extent the two of them were looking, so to speak, in similar ways in their kind of bourgeois life prior to the deportation. And there's a very striking page in Primo Levi where he says, and he admits in 1980, that the entire description of the October selection and the very inclusion of Renato stemmed less from a commitment to historical testimony than from the ambition for a literary coup de théâtre. And he says it is very alliterative, even perhaps a vice to épater the reader. So basically he admits that there was no such a confusion, that there was not a matter of René or Renato being selected at his place, and in fact this is true because in my reconstruction, Renato was selected 4 or 5 months before the October selection. So once more, Primo Levi is using here a kind of literary tool to underscore his moral point. But the problem of diverting the choice, as he once defined it, is there. So what were the Germans doing when they were including in the list of people to be gassed some names and not others, knowing that the medical reasons for those selection was pretty inconsistent because all these inmates were deeply and gravely sick. And it was almost difficult to tell which one among them was in a better shape than the other. And this is when I'm going to briefly introduce you in the remaining 10 minutes or so of my presentation with the second character of this lecture, and that is Sivajan. Sivajan is described by Primo Levi in a letter once more to his companion Jean Samuel in the following way. Sivajan, and he doesn't know the first name of the guy, French, silent type. I learned last year that he was a member of the secret resistance committee at Buna, that is at Monowitz. He was stealing dynamite at the construction site and preparing bombs. Can you believe it? In Monowitz, he was stealing dynamite and preparing bombs. It was a certain Besserman, a communist from Paris, who gave me this information, guaranteeing its authenticity. So Primo Levi is now writing, 15 years after having been liberated from Auschwitz, that one of his companions, Sivajan, whom he couldn't recall very well, was actually a resistant in the Buna. And he got this information from this Besserman. Okay? Apart from that, he says in a later book, The Drowned and the Saved, that Sivajan was a quiet and peaceful man. So this is a very important moment in Primo Levi's life, and that is when he discovers that some of these Jews who have been deported there not only were strong enough and resourceful enough or fortunate, lucky enough to survive, but they had been resisting the Germans, resisting to the Nazi, fighting back, answering a blow with a blow in a much more effective way that he ever was able to do just with his clogs against the leg of Elias Lindsay. And so once more, we have a very complicated and complex Primo Levi who is ready to say, even kind of harsh things on his companions, but who's always ready also to confess and to admit that others had been more effective, more courageous, brave than him. And but the importance of this moment, of this discovery, comes also from the fact that Primo Levi is here confronted with something that he didn't suspect at all while he was in Auschwitz, and that there was this network of resistance that not only were there to prepare bombs and try to revolt against the Nazi perpetrators, but they were trafficking with the list, the selection list, and tampering with them in order to save the resistance and condemn their apolitical prisoners, so to speak. And they were communists, and Primo Levi himself was a communist in democratic Italy, so a kind of moderate communist, but certainly a communist. So he was confronted with this discovery, and that resistance had taken place in Auschwitz in somehow a gray zone where the resistance themselves, the most powerful and courageous victims, were contributing to the selection of Musulmaner with the Germans. Okay, and so this is from an interview in the 80s, and where he tells the story of how he met this guy who he defines as a French survivor, and he told me that this is a lunch in Rome, and he told me that in Auschwitz-Monowitz he had been a member of a secret defense committee that many critical elements in the life of the lager derived from its deliberation, and that as a member of the French Communist Party, he had been assigned by the committee to work as a copyist in the political department, that is, the Gestapo department that dealt with political matters within the lager. For the sake of secrecy, each member knew only a very few of the others. In some particularly serious cases, and at great risk, they could delete the name from the list of those to be sent to the gas chambers at Birkenau and replace it with another name. Okay, I don't have time to introduce you to this, not French, but Polish guy, Besserman, this communist guy, nor I have time to tell you much about Sivajan, if not that Sivajan, first, he was not Jewish, he was Armenian. And he had moved to Paris from as an Armenian refugee as a child, and so he had escaped this other kind of genocide in Armenia from the Turks, and he became a pretty successful a scientist involved with the issue of several issues, including the issue of time. And he used to work at the very prestigious Institut Pasteur in Paris prior to his deportation, and he had published, among other books, these books on a kind of philosophical treatment of the problem of time. And so what happened is that he was a communist, and I was able to assess that what happened is that, in fact, he was saved himself after having been included in a list through bribery from the Polish communist companions of his clandestine network, and for the very modest sum of $25, Sivajan had been cancelled from the list of people to be sent to the gas chambers, and of course, somebody else went into his place. Because when the Germans came up with the list, it had to be 40 for a given day, or 50 or 60, and to take one of them out meant to add another one and to put another one in. Okay, so there's one single mention of Sivajan in Primo Levi's book, and no, I'm sorry, I don't have time to pause on that. I'm just going to tell you the fate of this Sivajan, and I'm going to finish by underscoring to what extent this fate is problematic in terms of assessing what have been my underlying theme in this series of lectures, and that is, once more, the problem of survival, and the problem of the gray zone, and the problem of some Jewish somehow belonging at least as much to the dark side of the spectrum than to the white side of the spectrum, and Primo Levi struggling not only to position his companions, but to position himself on that spectrum, either closer to the dark side of it, to the dark extreme of it, or to the white extreme of it. So Primo Levi talks in The Dawn of the Saved of this very issue of having contributed as a resistant to the selections, and he says this resistance had the power to substitute matriculation numbers on the list of prisoners destined for the gas chambers. Anyone who had the means and the desire to act in such manner, to fight the lager machine in this or in other ways, was protected from shame. Or at least from the kind of shame of which I speak, since he may perhaps feel another type of shame. So my last question would be, did Sivajan felt shameful, or on the contrary, proud of having been a resistant in Auschwitz. The bombs which I mentioned were the very bombs which were used by Sonderkommando members to revolt in the only revolt of the Sonderkommando in the fall of 1944. So we are talking about incredibly brave people who were taking pictures of the Sonderkommando operations and ultimately having the very facility bombed through these bombs. At the same time, we are talking about Levi's companions who might possibly have been shameful or ashamed in different ways. But this sentence, to me, is possibly the single sentence or single instance where the flattening of a character in Primo Levi's oeuvre carries more implications. Okay? A silent type, of whom he didn't know much, who possibly has a different kind of shame. Because behind the silence and stillness Levi attributes to Sivajans lies the entire tragedy of Nazi perpetrators, Jewish victims, and courageous and yet ultimately cynical resistance. So you now know me, and you're not going to be surprised if I tell you that I tracked Sivajan down. And he did survive through the same awful trajectory that Elias Lynching, as Henri, as the Dutch Kapo, and that these people who were not, as Primo Levi was, lucky to be left in the Cabé, in the infirmary, as Primo Levi was, at the liberation of the camp, but who had to endure the death march, and then Buchenwald in the fall of 1945, which was worse than Auschwitz in terms of conditions and survival conditions. He went all through that, and he ended up in Mauthausen. Okay, and a Mauthausen infirmary record dated his death as February 19, 1945. So I was able to find this document. I'm not going to be able to show it to you here, but they say Sivajan, Joseph, and then there's a mark underscoring the fact that he died there in February 1945, except that there's also a kind of second mark which suggests the idea that possibly he didn't die, and this was a confusion, an irregularity not in the selection list, but in the survival list, so to speak. And so the paradox of, I introduced this lecture by this series of lectures telling you that Primo Levi was pointing to the Pirandellian rebellion of his characters against him as an author. There's a kind of Pirandellian element even in the story of Sivajan, because Sivajan did survive, and he resumed his work at the Institut Pasteur in Paris. And he went on as a scientist throughout the 50s, the 60s, the 70s, and you can find, if you Google Joseph Sivajan, you are going to find, as I did, plenty of evidence of his scientific work in many fields. He was a physicist by training, but then a kind of philosophy of science in the very good French tradition of that. Except that in the main memorial of the murdered Jews they have in France, and that is the Mémorial de la Shoah in Paris, which has been recently built, you have the so-called Le Mur des Noms, that is the wall of names, which, following in the tradition of so many other memorials, starting with the Vietnam Memorial in Washington, D.C., basically the idea of this memorial is to name the names as a way of make sure that these victims at least are remembered in the memorial. And I don't know where, somewhere, following the alphabetical order of this list, you have Joseph Sivajan. So basically, Sivajan, in this very kind of Pirandellian way, was both dead and alive. And this is my last point. Primo Primo Levi flattened, among others, together with the character of the Dutch Kapo, he flattened even somehow the character of Sivat-Jean. But these characters do not deserve to be flattened, because they kind of hold and bring us, the readers, very kind of complicated stories and very kind of complex moral issues. In Monowitz, Besserman, the Polish guy that Primo Levi taught as French and with whom he had lunch in Rome in 1960, Besserman's group had removed Sivat-Jean's number from a selection list. And in Paris, Sivat-Jean is now sharing the memorial, possibly with the unknown man who went to the gas chamber in his place. Thank you very much.
Thank you for this brilliant and truly powerful lecture. Yeah, it gives me pause. I'm sure there are a few questions. Mariana, want to start? Let's see. Anyone else? If you don't mind.
Thank you so much, Sergio. This was very moving. Thank you. So you mentioned several times the judgmental eye of Primo Levi, and you insisted on some of the harsh judgments towards his companions. I would like to invite you to think about the tension between this judgmental eye that you're talking about and the suspension of judgment that we find instead, for instance, in the gray zone, when Levi challenges readers to think about the Sonderkommandos, the crows of the crematorium. No, the Sonderkommandos had the task to gas their companions, and he challenges readers to imagine, to inhabit their lives, the lives of the Sonderkommando, and then he says, la loro vita deve essere meditata con pietà e rigore, ma non deve essere giudicata. And today you showed us a sort of prehistory of that moment when you showed that paragraph in which Levi asked, should Kohn be judged? But then there it was in the form of a question, and instead in the drowned and the saved in the gray zone, it's a statement. Their lives must not be judged. And so yes, I would like to invite you to think about this tension between the judgmental eye and the impotentia giudicandi.
Absolutely, thank you so much for suggesting this, Mariana. I totally agree. I think there has been an evolution, a trend, so to speak, in Primo Levi's stance, going from a kind of more active judgmental eye to a much less active. And ultimately, in his latest book, which is his testamentary book, The Drowned and Saved, he's very much stepping back and basically saying, he talks about impotentia giudicandi, and he basically say that there should be no judgment, so to speak. But in my understanding and in my reading, this has been, as I said, an evolution. I think that, and this is, to me, is totally normal, I think. He wrote If This Is a Man when he was 26. What an astounding performance, right? It's almost unthinkable that somebody coming back from what he had been enduring and suffering would have this kind of incredibly strong power of detaching himself from the object and being able to be, the ethologist, the anthropologist of the lager. So it's just amazing the way, and when you compare what he wrote to other memoirs from other survivors published in the same years, there's almost no comparison. I mean, all of them are kind of screaming, up yelling and protesting and saying, look what they did, and he's reflecting, he's analyzing, he's making, moral statements, etc. But having become, when he was back and he was 26, I think it was totally understandable that he would be less, I would say, understanding towards those among his companions who had been, to him, compromising themselves in whatever way, including, for instance, making sex. I wasn't able to mention you that, but the way he was, despite the fact he was changing the name of Henri, the fact that he was representing him as a character from Sodoma, a sodomite in Auschwitz, which, by the way, is a representation that Henri ultimately rejected, I think shows this kind of very understandable attitude he had a few years or few months after having come back, and that is to be somehow rigorous and severe in his judgments. Then when he says, should Cohn be judged, in the mid-70s, he writes, I was unable to quote that, Cohn is guilty, okay? So at the mid-70s, when he starts designing this idea of the gray zone, he still thinks that, there were guilty Jews down there, and particularly the ones who were belonging to somehow shifting to the perpetrator's side instead of somehow being resigned to belong to the blank, so to speak, side of the Muslim, etc. I think that what his last book shows and attests and underscores is that in the later stage of his life, he was much less judgmental than he had been before. I don't know what you think, you are such a wonderful connoisseur of Primo Levi's oeuvre. I don't know what you think about that, but I think, it's always difficult to know how a writer would have written his, early works in a later stage of his life, except if they do not write a kind of, new edition but I do find, in terms of the moral judgment, his latest book, The Dawn That Saved, to be very different from If This Is a Man. And we may want to discuss to what should we be attributing this evolution, to the kind of maturity, even kind of moral maturity that he might have achieved in the later stage of his life, or to a different take. In my opinion, he became more lenient, so to speak, because he understood that somehow he himself had survived through compromise, okay? And so this is the ultimate, I would say, tension that you were talking about, the tension that I recognize there. Leniency came from self-criticism, so to speak, if I can put it in this very basic way. He came to terms with the idea that, which is of course the very idea of The Dawn of the Saved, he has this incredibly powerful page on the survivors not being the real victims and not being the real Auschwitz, not being representatives of the Jewish condition, because he says the real representatives of the Jewish condition are those who didn't come back, okay, are the Musulmaner, the integral victims, so to speak. So I think that he became more lenient simply because it was a matter for him almost of psychological acceptance and survival, so to speak. He couldn't keep being judgmental without being judgmental even towards himself, so to speak. And we are not going to speculate about Primo Levi's suicide, which isn't a matter of discussion, but I believe that somehow the tension stayed there until the very last stages of his life.
Thank you. Other questions?
Thanks for the lectures. They were really important to me. And I have a question, but based on what you said in the last few minutes, I think I can visualize the answer you're gonna give. But it is related in part to your profession of historian, even if I would say that you are more a critic. As Fortini would say, the critic is the one that is able to play with different fields and mix them together to convey an answer. And my question is related to the concept of fortune, and you mentioned it a few times today, and you used the word fortune and luck. So since you showed a lot of connections between events, I would like to, this is a kind of epistemological question, how an historian relates to Primo Levi stating multiple times in his interviews and even at the beginning of If This Is a Man that he was saved by chance, by caso. And then if you could talk maybe about this chance for Primo Levi. Is it a Machiavellian fortune that, so to speak, you need to bend in order to save yourself and to try the way to save yourself? Or is it a providential one, even if he wasn't a religious man? Or is it, as Benjamin said, I was reading Benjamin this morning, so il caso è la figura della necessità abbandonata da Dio.
Monumental questions.
Yeah. Maybe the first part is certainly
first of all, the sub-theme of fortune, fortuna or caso in Primo Levi's has been very well studied, particularly by an English literary critic, Robert Gordon, who teaches at Cambridge. And so there's actually that book, which comes from a series of lectures on the very theme of the use of the notion of fortuna, which of course has a polysemic meaning in Latin, and Primo Levi knew that in Primo Levi. Besides that, fortuna is possibly the first substantive of Primo Levi's book. In the introduction he wrote in 1958, he introduced the reader to his memoir by writing and saying, "Ho avuto la fortuna di essere deportato ad Auschwitz nel febbraio del 1944," which of course it's almost a paradox because there was no luck there. But you asking, seen from the perspective of an historian what that entails. In fact, he's totally right. Being deported to Auschwitz in relatively late could be a matter of luck as compared to people who were deported there earlier on, because actually the whole system came apart. The whole system of the extermination came apart, say, 5 or 9 months later, instead of 3 or 4 months later, as was the case for people who had been deported. So Primo Levi knew that, and which doesn't mean that people who were deported to Auschwitz in 1944 survived easily, so to speak. The figures are just horrendous, and particularly the Hungarian Jews who were deported in the summer of 1944 went directly, basically, from the trains to the gas chambers. And actually, those of you who have visited Auschwitz may know that what we see now, even in the photographs from Birkenau, and that is the railway tracks arriving into the camp, was not what Primo Levi experienced when he arrived in February 1944. At that time, until the spring of 1944, there was no railway train getting directly into the extermination camp. It was 3 or 4 kilometers away in the regular, so to speak, railway station of Auschwitz, Oswiecim. And the Germans built, actually the inmates of the Germans, on behalf of the Germans, built the railway station and prolonged the railway station into the Birkenau precinct, so to speak, in order to be closer to the gas chambers, because the Hungarian Jews were to be gassed basically right away, not even undergoing a selection. So Primo Levi knew what he meant when he said that he had been lucky to be deported, relatively speaking, late. But I think the moral weight of your question goes beyond that, and in that sense, it is not my role as an historian to answer, but rather as whatever, a critic, which I'm not. I'm very much a kind of menial, modest historian. But so I think the notion is very complex, because talking about trends in Primo Levi's reflection and retrospective gaze, I think for the first kind of decades after his survival, he tended to invest in this idea of having been lucky, so to speak. But when you follow the use of the very word fortuna or caso in the later stage of his production and his literary works, I think that he started in kind of questioning himself on whether that so-called luck was not necessarily luck, but, so to speak, experience in navigating the system, so to speak, and in being able to understand which kind of answers provide, or et cetera, et cetera. So I think, and to the best of my recollection, Robert Gordon didn't do that. I think one made kind of check the use of the word fortune, not just in the literary oeuvre as such, but the evolution of that notion. And I wouldn't be surprised if you were to find that there, either in the Machiavellian sense of the word or on any other one, the Primo Levi ultimately came up with the idea that having been lucky, so to speak, stemmed from something else, and that is being able to organize, and ultimately, once more, being able to, ready to compromise with the system, and that is with the Nazis.
Okay, maybe one last question, and it's you.
Thank you again, Sergio, for these wonderful lectures. I was also thinking of the difference of attitude between If This Is a Man and The Gray Zone or The Drawn and Saved from the very first lecture that you gave, and I wrote down a few words from The Drawn and the Saved that are: la condizione di offeso non esclude la colpa, e spesso questa è obiettivamente grave, ma non conosco tribunale umano a cui delegarne la misura. And I was thinking, we're probably, I mean, I'm sure you're absolutely right in saying that there is an evolution in his, in the way he sees different characters. I was wondering whether, and I'd like to know your opinion, whether this difference is also because of the different genres he's writing on. I mean, Barenghi kind of underlined that If This Is a Man, or the paratext, you say paratext in English, right? The paratext, Jeanette, as usual. The paratext is kind of, there is an incongruence between the poem Shema and the introduction. Because one is an accusation, and it's like, you should, it has this sacred but also accusatory tone, and the other one is very prosaic. And then it says, I just want to understand. So these two elements, the accusation and the essayistic one, in order to understand, are both at the core of the If This Is a Man. While in The Gray Zone, not only, of course, it's not, I mean, time has passed, but also it's a different genre. It's purely an essay, not a mix of memoir and an essay. And so it calls for also for a different attitude. I don't know, I was just thinking this while you were talking. I'd like to...
Sure, I believe you're right. I believe you're right. By the way, the foreword or introduction to Primo Levi, where he says, I'm just going to provide here some kind of cool, almost scientific elements of reflection, etc., was an addition to the 1958 edition. So in the 1947 edition, the first edition, there was no such an introduction. But of course, Shema, without the title, was already there. So I think you're right. And not only there is this, I would say, this possible, array of genres, the prose and the essay and the memoir, but also, I may say, the poem. I mean, to use poetic words and to choose that genre is different from writing in prose. And so I believe that, and actually I'm not the only one, very, very good literary critics have worked on La Poesia di Primo Levi, Primo Levi as a poet, and they did underscore their difference in tone and in register, and even in vocabulary that is recognizable from the poems as compared to the written prosaic, as you said, word. Yes.
Now we clap. All right.
Thank you so much for your unfailing support and patience and